Good evening. My name is Desiree Chen, and I'm Managing Director of Public Affairs here at Elmhurst College. Tonight, I have the privilege of welcoming you to the third in our year-long series of lectures addressing the topic of education in crisis. This series explores a wide array of issues and challenges facing education in the United States today. What makes schools work? Which reform efforts have paid off and which ones have fallen flat? Why are boys more likely than girls to struggle in school? Speakers from a variety of perspectives have been invited to address these and other questions as part of our series. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Debbie Cosgrove, Director of Elementary Education, so that she can come to the podium and introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Paul Vallas. Dr. Cosgrove earned her PhD in Curriculum and Instruction from the University of Illinois at Chicago. She taught for 18 years in diverse public school settings, in grades K through 6, and served for 18 years in public school administration as an elementary principal, curriculum director, and assistant superintendent. She is a member of the American Educational Research Association, the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, and the International Reading Association. Her research interests include teacher preparation and leadership, curriculum design, and teaching linguistically and culturally diverse students. Here's Dr. Debbie Cosgrove. Thank you.
Good evening. Paul G. Vallas is known across the education sector for his leadership and expertise in reforming and rebuilding school districts in the wake of both natural and man-made disasters. He recently completed his tenure as superintendent of the Recovery School District of Louisiana, a statewide turnaround district that has successfully reformed the public schools in post-Katrina New Orleans. In 2010, concurrent with his responsibilities in New Orleans, Mr. Vallas was appointed to 2 large international projects. In the first, he was asked to serve as a lead education consultant to the government of Haiti in the wake of the January 12th earthquake. This 5-year initial project makes education accessible to all of Haiti's 500,000 children and includes the construction or reconstruction of 4,000 schools. The second project came at the invitation of the government of Chile, which has asked Mr. Vallas to assume responsibility for turning around and improving test scores in 1,100 of Chile's lowest performing schools. Before his tenure in New Orleans and his work abroad, Mr. Vallas served as the Chief Executive Officer of the Chicago and Philadelphia school districts. He is currently serving as a superintendent of schools in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Prior to Mr. Vallas's work in the education sector, he served as the budget director for the city of Chicago. His work in state government included service on the Illinois Economic and Fiscal Commission and as principal advisor to the Illinois State Senate Revenue, Elementary and Secondary Education and Appropriations Commissions. Mr. Vallas's wide-ranging experience has led him to believe that any school system, whether a domestic district or an international nationwide system, can be reformed in spite of natural or man-made disaster, troubled finances, poorly trained teachers, or political and community disunity. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Paul Vallas to our Elmhurst College community.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry it took me so long. As you know, I ran against Rod Blagojevich once, so when people always ask me, well, you know, why did you go to New Orleans and why did you go to Haiti? I said, I'm still doing my penance for having lost to Rod Blagojevich, you know. I didn't want that to be on my tombstone. Of course, you know, a lot of people joke that if I only would have flown a couple times, I probably would have won the election. Well, now, I remember my campaign manager, Matt Ryan, who passed away, was just wonderful, a longtime friend of mine. He was in the hospital, and he had heard that I was flying back and forth from Haiti, and he was so mad at me because, of course, during the campaign, I think he convinced me to fly 3 times. And he said, if only he had gotten the Haiti call, you know, 2 or 3 years earlier. But it's great to be back home, and it's great to be here. I was here many, many, many years ago, and I've always enjoyed my experiences It's nice to see some old faces, and so welcome. What I want to do is I want to talk about the challenges that we face in public education and what went wrong and what we need to do to get it right. And I'm going to touch on a lot of things, and then the best part for me is always kind of an open question and answer. I'm going to try to speak for about 45 minutes, which means I won't cut my remarks short. I'll just speak faster, and but then I'll hang around since I'm spending the night before I fly back to Bridgeport tomorrow to stick around and answer as many questions as you like or engage in as many debates on as many topics as you wish. So I came here to talk and at the same time to listen and to be challenged a bit or a lot. And so it's just so let me get started. Let me make a couple. We're facing great challenges: globalization, economic liberalization, the telecommunications revolution, the international investment that other countries are making in education. For the first time in our history, we are moving into a position of decisive disadvantage when it comes to competing in other countries, because they are, for all practical purposes, catching up. I mean, it was great when you had the Iron Curtain and basically China was subsisting on, I don't know, 1,400 calories a day, and they weren't cornering the market on anything, and they weren't competing for natural resources. When the economies, when the Iron Curtain economies were obviously dominated by those totalitarian states. I mean, the bottom line here is, as the Iron Curtain has fallen, and as these economies have liberalized, the competition that we face economically is much greater than it's ever been in the past. So our ability to monopolize and to dominate the economic scene has significantly been diminished. Also, as these countries have liberated their economies, or at least partially liberated their economies, and as the underdeveloped and developed world has begun to recognize the importance of investing in education, our decisive edge in the educational arena has significantly diminished. There was a time when we were probably the leading nation, or among the leading nations, certainly among the large nations, the leading nation, and the percentage of our populace who went on to post-secondary education. That is no longer the case. I read a statistic somewhere that said we're either 8th or 9th. We always seem to have this decisive advantage in the higher educational institutions. Our K-12 systems have always struggled. There's always been much greater competition. But when it came to higher ed, because of the diversity of choices and the various avenues that people could continue their education, we always had that decisive edge. But that edge is becoming less and less significant. We are losing our advantage, and when we lose that advantage, it'll, I think, ultimately put us at a disadvantage. So countries are catching up. Countries are investing in education. The economic competition has never been greater. The fundamental challenge that we face as a nation has been to educate this next generation, to meet the needs of the evolving and of the changing economy. There is some debate as to whether or not we are prepared to do that, in part because if you look at educational institutions today, or if you look at our educational systems, in some circles there's this belief that they are not adequate, that they somehow have struggled, that they somehow have fallen further and further behind. I tend to think that what's happening to us in education is not that our educational institutions are worse than they were years ago. I actually think they're better. I don't think the curriculum has ever been stronger. I think the teaching has never been better. I think the standards have never been higher. But the question is, have these changes been enough? In other words, are the educational institutions evolving in a way that allows those educational services to keep pace with the changing economy? Look, the changes that are impacting the quality of our lives that maybe used to happen every 20 years now seems to be happening every year, or sometimes every 6 months. I know the quality of life for my sons becomes significantly altered anytime they introduce a new PlayStation. then certainly the quality of their life has been adversely impacted if they don't have it. But my point is, it's almost as if the changes are coming in rapid fire, and the question is, how do we adjust governmental institutions to adapt, to accommodate, to provide the critical services that we need so that we can adapt as a society and we can adapt as a people. Governmental institutions by their nature are not proactive but reactive. Government institutions by their nature move much slower than the changes surround them. And in part, this is because government institutions, as they become more inefficient, just in effect end up a lot of times getting more funding. There is not this survival instinct. They're more entrenched. They become more bureaucratic. The government institutions begin to lose they may have been created or structured in such a way to serve an economy of yesteryear, but that same organizational structure does not allow them to serve the economy of today. So the big challenge that we have is not only how to modernize our government institutions, but how to create the institutional flexibility that allows those government institutions to evolve. The key is the ability to evolve, to adjust. Because, we're reaching a point in this technological age where we are no longer telling technology what we want, but technology seems to be telling us what it wants. We are now the tail being wagged by the dog, so to speak. So the ability to have our institutions provide the educational services that we critically need require some institutional elasticity. In other words, we need to not have so many obstacles to designing schools and to staffing schools for the benefit of the children. So that's the challenge that we face. The challenge that we face is not only to modernize our institutions and to make them relevant again, but to provide for the institutional flexibility to allow that to continue to happen. Let me talk about some obstacles to having that flexibility. Well, the first obstacle are those institutional obstacles. Restrictions on your ability to increase the instructional time on task, the length of our day, the length of our year. We have the shortest instructional day, instructional year among industrial nations. The inability to design schools to benefit kids, the inability to staff schools, the inability to have the autonomy to staff your schools, to make your personnel decisions in the best interests of the children. It confines us. It limits our freedom of action. It impedes our ability to make the type of changes, make the type of staffing decisions, to design the type of school day and school year that will benefit the children, that can advance the cause of the educational services that we're providing. There's also protectionism, the inability everything seems to be protected. Everything seems to be dictated by state mandate, by contractual mandate. So much of what governs a school, what guides a school, is not necessarily related to what's in the best interest of the children or to the best practices that are needed to be institutionalized in that school in order to provide quality instruction. It impedes, you're handcuffed. Everything is governed by something that is not always related to creating an instructional environment conducive for learning. Mandated costs, I think schools are underfunded. I think teachers and principals are underpaid. But at the end of the day, so much of our freedom of action is being constricted by the fact that more and more of our resources are being diverted to things that do not impact positively in the classroom. In Bridgeport, 22% of my budget, Bridgeport's probably the poorest funded school district in the state of Connecticut, yet 22% of that very poorly funded school district has to go to employee health care and workman's compensation, 22% of that budget. 22%. The utilization rate is, I think, 30 or 40% higher than like the statewide government employee average. More and more of our costs. When I left the Chicago Public Schools in 1995, my pension contribution was $65 million, and the fund was 100% funded. Today, I don't know what the percentage unfunded liability is, but all I know is, what's the bill, $500 million? I mean, last year, I think Quinn increased the education budget by $400 million, and $500 million went into the retirement system. I mean, we're moving backwards. and more resources being diverted away from the classrooms. That means shorter school days. That means less resources into the classroom. So those are obstacles. Those are obstacles that are impeding our ability and denying us the flexibility we need to allocate our resources in the most cost-effective way, to staff in the most efficient way possible, to design our school year and school day in ways that are in the best interest of the kids. And the key here is not Common Core. The key here is not more draconian teacher evaluations. The key here is not testing and over-testing and over-testing. The key here is to remove those fundamental obstacles that allow you to staff and allow you to schedule and allow you to design schools to benefit kids. That's the fundamental lesson that we learned from high-performing schools and the fundamental lesson that we learned from high-performing school districts. Now I want to talk about, I've worked in a lot of districts, and when you've been in the eye of the storm as long as I have, you have your critics. It's like the good, the bad, and the ugly, all in combination. Okay, all in combination. And I've worked with traditional schools, and I've worked with charter schools, and I've had success with all. And I've grown to believe that there are certain fundamental, essential practices that exist in all high-performing schools, and you see them, whether they're parochial schools or private schools, whether they're charter schools, whether they're traditional schools. There are certain common practices that exist. You see them. You see them in schools that are performing in high poverty areas, that schools that are servicing challenged populations. So my approach and my strategy has always been to ensure that the schools, whether they're charters or traditional schools, are all embracing those essential practices, and that I'm supporting the implementation of those practices, and that I'm removing obstacles that keep those essential practices from being effectively implemented. So let me talk about those essential practices. The first essential practice is when you look at high-performing schools, all those schools have a comprehensive curriculum and instructional strategy, and that strategy is from kindergarten all the way through high school. And that strategy is aligned. It's aligned not only to standards, state standards, or whatever standards that state is providing, but also what is done at every grade level is in alignment. There's an alignment. There's a consistency. Every grade prepares that student for the next grade. So the best curriculum and instructional models or the best schools have a curriculum instructional model. They have curriculum instructional strategies. They have perfect alignment. They have preparation. Every grade leads into the next grade. And the best curriculum instructional models have high quality differentiated instruction because there is differentiated learning going on. Children, particularly in large urban districts, are going to learn at, it's not uncommon, particularly in the higher grades, to have children who are maybe 4 years or 5 years academically apart, and sometimes even more. So the inability to provide for that differentiation and to accommodate can sometimes slow the continued progress of the students who are performing because of that natural tendency to dummy down the curriculum. And obviously, you're not serving the underserved or the children that are struggling any better if you're teaching them to standards that they can't grasp. So quality curriculum instructional programs always exist. The strategy always exists in high-performing schools. Second thing is data. Really quality schools have a data system. I'm not talking about an over-testing system. I'm talking about a data system, a simple benchmarking system. The most effective schools in recent years have had well-developed RTI systems, response to intervention. You measure student progress. You begin to you measure student progress, and not by over-testing. You measure student progress by giving them benchmark assessments every 6 weeks, every 8 weeks. Some of the really high-performing schools give you even more frequent benchmarks. These aren't the benchmarks that take a whole day. They take an hour. They take an hour and a half. You get the results that day. You're able to plot. You're able to determine who's struggling and why they're struggling and what the most appropriate intervention is. So the use of data and the effective use of data, high-performing schools use data to evaluate and to track student performance, so as early as the 6th, 7th week they can make adjustments. And they also use that data to identify those teachers that are struggling, not so that they can punish them, but so that they can provide them with more support, so that the instruction does not languish. The third component that you always find in high-performing schools is an intervention strategy, a strategy for intervening to keep students from falling behind further. RTI or different versions of RTI, a system in which you use data to place children in tiers, and you design specific interventions, scientifically proven interventions, to get those students from the lower tier to the higher tier. And really good RTI systems allow for enrichment and acceleration for those students that are not in the intervention programs, because you want to continue to keep them challenged. You do not want them to fall off. So the best RTI programs not only tier their interventions, but they also have accelerated enrichment so that the kids that are not in RTI interventions during that same period of time are going through accelerated enrichment, and it takes various components. But the most effective schools have intervention strategies. The most effective schools don't wait until the end of the first quarter or the first semester to determine how students are performing before they provide them with help. They provide help, and they apportion a part of that school day to provide consistent interventions. The best schools and the most effective schools have a teacher training strategy that is comprehensive and year-long. And it's not the type of training strategy that pulls the teachers out of their schools and sends them to some far-off place to have group hugs and to sing Kumbaya and to learn about higher-order thinking skills. It's the type of training that trains them on how to deliver the curriculum and instructional models, how to look at the data, and how to deliver intervention. It is efficient, task-oriented training. And even that training is differentiated. You don't train the teacher, the new teacher who has mastered Scholastic on how to do Scholastic. You have that teacher train the teacher that is struggling with Scholastic or Read 180 or Fast Forward or Fast Math or whatever intervention strategy you're using. But the training is constant. The training and the interaction and the collaboration is constant so that you're guiding and monitoring. And the most effective teachers and the most effective training program uses that classroom data to trigger what I call differentiated professional development. So you're training teachers on what they need, and you're not simply doing redundant training on teachers who don't need to learn something that they've already mastered. The fifth most critical component is having strong instructional leadership teams. When you look at high-quality schools, those schools always are driven not just by a principal, but they have well-organized instructional leadership teams. The principal, the assistant principal, their best and their strongest teachers comprise a team. They comprise a team that drives instruction. They comprise a team that determines the appropriate tiering of the students, the appropriate interventions, that looks at the data, that does the analysis, that identifies the teachers that are struggling, that are in need of additional help. So you're not dependent on one individual. In other words, the objective, by having superior curriculum instructional programs, by having a well-thought-out data system, a system of assessment and evaluation, by having interventions not only for students that are struggling, but for teachers that are struggling and are in need of help, by having a professional development strategy that differentiates the professional development to the needs of the individual teachers and provides for task-oriented professional development, and schools that have strong instructional leadership teams. These are institutional elements in those schools that help ensure that there is continuity, because these elements continue to become refined. If you have the right instructional leadership team, you're continually refining your curriculum, or maybe modifying your benchmarks, or maybe modifying your professional development. So it's a constant evolution. It's a constant adjustment. But you need to be able to identify and recruit the best and the brightest into positions of responsibility. You need to have a curriculum instruction, the autonomy to not only design the curriculum instructional plan and to design the intervention plan, but also to have to be able to set aside and allocate enough instructional time on task, because there is a difference between the amount of instructional time on task and school effectiveness. If we knew that 15% more instructional time could make a difference, if 15% more instructional time could make a difference, but we couldn't afford that 15% more time, or if we knew that 15% more instructional time so that we could have more time to do intervention, so we could spend an hour a day or maybe 90 minutes a day doing interventions. And if we could mandate more professional development for teachers that are struggling, if we knew that those things absolutely made a difference, but we didn't have more money to spend on it, would we as teachers still want that to be done? It's like you're a physician and you know you can cure that patient, but that patient does not have the money to buy the cure. Would you still cure that patient? I mean, that's the dilemma that many, many school districts are facing as we move forward. So there are essential practices that exist in all high-performing schools, and it's essential that we remove the obstacles to allow those essential practices, to be implemented, and to be implemented with fidelity. Now, let me tell you, the reforms in New Orleans, I've been a superintendent for like 18 years. I've never had a year when my test scores didn't go down, except this year, when I went to the Common Core. And the bottom didn't fall out, Some grades they went down, some grades they went up. We kind of held our own. New York, I think, plummeted like 30%, with the exception of third grade, new curriculum. All right, so I'm used to having great success. And next year, because we've gone to the Common Core a year early, we're going to be ready for a robust year next year or the year that follows. But in Chicago and Philadelphia, where math scores tripled and reading scores doubled over a 6-year period, in New Orleans, where the Recovery School District has produced the most significant improvement in test scores, not only in the state, but among school districts across the nation, those scores, those successes have been because every year more and more schools move to these essential practices. More and more of schools embrace the essential practices. I went to New Orleans in 2007, stayed to 2011, until I was invited to go work in Haiti. During that period of time, the number of students testing at proficiency in special ed was 11%. It is now 40%. At that time, there was a 26 percentage point gap between the New Orleans schools and the state. That gap, as of last year, prior to the most recent test scores, had fallen to 6%. African American students are now graduating at a 15 percentage point rate higher than they are nationally. The test scores, depending on the grades you look at, have either increased at 3 times the rate that they've increased at the state level, or 7 times the rate that they've increased at the state level. Now, and let me point out that the Recovery School District is 99% Recovery School District, which comprises 80% of the schools in New Orleans, is 99% African American, because the failing schools that they were taken over were heavily segregated, about 85% poverty, and they have twice the number of special education students that the remaining traditional schools have. So the whole myth, they're not taking special ed kids or whatever, is hogwash. We get all the special ed kids. Why did that happen? It didn't happen because we embraced the Common Core, and I have nothing wrong with the Common Core. We just have to be careful that we don't try to develop a national curriculum for the entire country out of the Common Core. Okay, we still need flexibility. We don't want to create the Common Core industry here. We want the Common Core to guide us, but we need the autonomy and the flexibility to operate within it. That's why we've embraced the Common Core. That's why we're implementing the Common Core. But we don't want to become a prisoner of the Common Core. Is it because we adopted a new assessment system? Absolutely not. I think Louisiana is now getting around to its new teacher assessment system. No change in the assessment system. It's because we changed the tests to come up with more draconian tests? No. I mean, I was gone before the state's new assessment system came out. Actually, the state did make one change. They raised the bar on what constituted underperforming grades. The success in New Orleans was because those schools had the freedom to be designed in ways that would benefit kids, because they could adopt these essential practices, because they could implement these essential practices, because they weren't constrained when designing their school day or their school year, or how they staffed or how they promoted. And all the schools were subject to the same type of rigorous accountability system, which said if you are constantly failing, we're going to look for a new model, but we're going to look for that model, and there's going to be no displacement of the children. There's going to be no opening up a new school and dispatching the student population to the 4 corners of the city. No. We were going to look to strengthen the school, so at the end of the day, the kids would just be in a better program. That is the type of freedom and the type of flexibility that translates into not only improved performance, but sustained improvement in performance. Now, another thing about the Recovery School District, too, all the schools outside New Orleans that the Recovery School District took over, and you have to understand, back in 2007, I think my first 60 days, I had to open 22 schools or build 22 campuses and find 600 teachers. I mean, there was nothing there. So we had to build things from scratch. But outside New Orleans, eventually over that 4-year period, the Recovery School District intervened in 22 other schools in other districts. Those were all traditional schools. None of those schools were chartered. But all those schools adopted the core essential practices. All those schools developed curriculum instructional programs, school leadership programs, training programs that were consistent with these best practices. And 80% of those schools improved, and 80% of those schools made significant progress, where most of them were actually able to leave the state's watch list. Traditional schools having the flexibility and the autonomy to design best practices that are designed to improve instruction, that are designed to benefit kids. So, that's the challenge that we face. So when we talk about the role of the state or the role of school districts, state boards of education and school district administrations need to become school improvement agencies, not agencies that micromanage. The role of the government is to the role of a district administration is to be a school improvement institution. And what do I mean by that? That means to identify and to present and to make available the best models, the best model curriculum, the best training programs, the best school leadership programs. In other words, to become the R&D office. A large district needs to be the R&D center for the district. The state needs to become an R&D institution for school districts throughout the state. So those schools that do not have the best practices can access the best practices. They need to be the school. They need to be the entity that identifies the best practices and then works to bring those best practices to scale. They need to be an entity that provides the data, that provides schools, in the case of a district or in the case of the state, that provides the schools and the school districts with the information that they need so that they can make decisions about interventions and they can make decisions about what additional supports are needed based on reliable data. They need to be there to provide the data so critical to drive instruction forward. The role of the central office should be to intervene in failing schools, but not to intervene in failing schools in a draconian way, but to intervene in failing schools or failing school districts in a constructive way, to bring the superior models to those failing schools, to incubate those superior models without displacing the kids. School reform should not be closing a school and dispatching kids to the four corners of the district. School reform means bringing better models to that school and to that neighborhood so you can stabilize the school and you can stabilize the neighborhood. The role of the central office should be to promote training and collaboration, to go into those districts, or in the case of a district, to go into those schools where the teachers are struggling, to provide the additional training and to provide the additional interventions that are needed, so that the school is better equipped to implement their curriculum instructional school improvement plan. And finally, the role of the central office should be to remove obstacles to schools being designed to benefit kids, to take the mandates away, to remove the mandates, to remove the obstacles that limit your day and limit the year, that remove the impediments to ensure that when it comes to leadership and when it comes to recruiting and assigning people to that school, the best and the brightest, and those who have achieved and those who have been successful are the ones that are going in. That you have the autonomy to make personnel decisions and to make decisions about how you structure your school and how you schedule in the best interest of the children. That should be the role of a district administration. That should be the role of a state board of education. The risk we run as we wrestle with school reforms nationwide is that they will collapse under the weight of a complicated Common Core They'll collapse under the weight of a teacher assessment system that consumes way too much time, administrative time, way too much principal time, a evaluation system that is not a constructive tool for improving teacher performance and teacher effectiveness. This isn't a tool to punish teachers. It should be an instrument to help teachers improve, to help them in many ways self-improve. The evaluation itself should be a self-improvement guide. And you know, testing kids in March and producing the results in August is not effective assessment. It's not the effective accumulation of data. It's irrelevant data. You know, the type of assessments that are most effective are those assessments that provide you with information on a continuous basis so that you can make an adjustment on a continuous basis. So you're not waiting for that data to arrive long after the school year has ended and only weeks before you're ready to start up the new school year. So that's the challenge that we face. You know, we don't want to overregulate. Rather, we need to remove obstacles. I mean, there are teachers and principals and school administrators across this country working in traditional schools and non-traditional schools, producing extraordinary results under the most trying circumstances. We know what works. Our role is to identify those models and to replicate those models and to remove the obstacles that allow those models to be replicated. And that's the one thing that I've learned during my 18 years, and that's and that's the one thing that has guided me as I've taken on these new assignments and responsibilities. So that's about it. I'll open it up to any questions you may have, and we can get it started. Thank you very much for the invitation. Okay.
If you have a question for Mr. Vallas, if you could come to either Peggy at her microphone or to me, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yes, I saw on the news today that the head of the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana got a $90,000 bonus. He still doesn't make as much as the football coach. Could you speak to the idea of a cash incentive bonus for public school educational leadership and staff?
Right. I'm not a pay-for-performance guy. I'm like a performance-for-pay guy. You know, I believe that when you create a lot of these pay-for-performance programs cannot be sustained. Okay, you know, you try to raise a lot of money, you provide the pay. You know, when you take a job, your pay should be a reward. Your pay should be enough to, hopefully you're not taking the job because of the pay, but if you're going to take a job, that pay should be the reward for the work that you do, and the work that you do should be of an exemplary nature. I think when you start creating an incentive system, you create the tale of two cities within schools. You take the teachers who suddenly, it almost gives you, you know, let's say you're not the most gifted teacher, you're not the most flashy teacher, and somehow you don't get rewarded and you don't get recognized. Well, you know, after a while, that can be pretty demoralizing. You know, that can, you know, after a while, that may encourage you to become complacent. You don't put in that extra time. You don't work quite as hard. You know, I just think that it is not a healthy situation when you create a system where half the teachers are getting rewarded because they're doing exceptionally well and the other half are not getting rewarded. I believe that teachers who perform, who do exemplary work, should be rewarded by getting additional responsibilities, because then when you pay them for those additional responsibilities, I think there's less hostility, there's less jealousy, there's less a feeling that I'm being kind of ostracized, I'm not being noticed. So I'm for promotion and additional responsibilities and additional pay for performance. All right, so you create a system where you're recognizing and rewarding your best teachers by promoting them, by putting them on the instructional leadership team. You know, one of the things that we did in Bridgeport was we eliminated all of our coaching positions in the schools, and we created a whole new series of positions that were temporary positions. In other words, you occupied a position and then you get, and then you have to be reassigned and reappointed so that we could get beyond the tenure and seniority issues. But what we wanted to do was we wanted the coaches and instructional support personnel in the schools to be the best, to be those individuals who are high achieving. So we wanted to reward them by giving them these opportunities to assume these leadership positions, these mentoring positions, these training positions, and to be rewarded for it. And you know what? It's amazing how the reaction, how there's been no adverse reaction. The union's been comfortable and they haven't complained. The teachers understand who's been promoted. There's an acceptance that the people who we have put into these positions are people of extraordinary credentials, irregardless of their time and grade, so to speak. So you know, I believe that you create a system that allows your strongest people to take on additional responsibilities, to get promoted into positions that will ultimately pay them better. I think, first of all, that's the type of pay for performance that you can justify. And that's the type of pay for performance that can be accepted throughout the school. And that's the type of pay for performance that you can sustain. That's not something that you're going to do for 3 or 4 years, and then when the money runs out, no one gets any incentive for high performance. So that's my attitude. As you can see, I feel pretty strong about that. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Mr. Son?
Yeah.
I was excited when you started talking about student-centered, your student-centered philosophy, and all resources should be devoted to the classroom and to the student by implication. But then during the hour of presentation, it seemed like you were very teacher-centered, very institution-centered, and to me that translates into bureaucracy, in, you know, in my experience. And you said very little, if anything, that I remember about the experience of the student, of the children, in learning. So my question then would be to get you to talk a little bit about that in relation to inner city schools, where I have some experience. What are we doing, in your opinion, in inner city schools for the children? What is our purpose, apart from hopefully getting them to score on tests and then to graduate, but what are we preparing them for in life? And I ask the question because it seems to me oftentimes that children in those situations in many cities across the country are completely handicapped for life by virtue of the experience they get in the schools.
Okay, good question. You know, part of the problem is you're on a timer, and you know, you could probably spend 2 hours on each of the essential practices, and of course they have their own like sub-practices. You know, let me just, first of all, let me tell you what I believe puts young people at a disadvantage from who come from families with limited means. In the more affluent communities, there's a much greater likelihood that those children who start school are going to start school with not 1 year, but maybe 2 years or 3 years of daycare and early childhood education. You know, they're going to have been exposed to 6 to 7 times the number of vocabulary words that the low-income child has been exposed to. You've seen the studies. You know, they will have their early intervention and their stimulus would have begun between the ages of 0 to 3, not just 4. We kind of wait. We think we're making progress because, you know, we expand early childhood educational opportunities for children who are like 4 years old. Well, that's too late. You know, what, 70% of the brain development occurs during the first 3 years. So the bottom line is that places low-income children at a disadvantage. Another thing that places low-income children at a disadvantage is the fact that there is so much idle time during the school year in which they cannot be in the type of stimulus programs or instructional support programs, the activities, the summer activities. Very often for low-income children, for children who come from families where single-parent families where the one parent is struggling to hold the family together and sometimes working 2 or 3 jobs, we always assume that that 10 weeks of idle, 11 weeks of idle time over the summer can be really destructive. The amount of knowledge that is lost over that period is significant. So what happens is we have children who start school behind, and every single year they fall further behind compared to children from more affluent families and from higher income brackets, because really the amount of instruction, the amount of stimulus that they're receiving is significantly less when looked over that entire year. So I think what we've got to do, you know, that's why I'm I'm a strong advocate for universal early childhood, beginning cradle to the classroom. We had a program. Ron Whitmore actually ran the program because he was the director of early childhood education, where we would identify pregnant teens in, I think, like 20 different high schools. I think over that period we had 2,500 pregnant teens go through the program. The whole idea was to identify a pregnant teen, make sure the baby was born healthy, put the baby in daycare, get the baby in daycare, provide the mother with basic parenting skills, and make sure that all the healthcare services, the appropriate healthcare services were provided. Well, 8 years later, when those students hit third grade, there was no achievement gap. And the graduation rate among the parents, the mothers, we rarely identified the fathers, but the mothers in the program was 85%. A much smaller program in Connecticut produces 90% graduation rates. But just imagine if you took something that to scale. That in itself could do more to break the cycle of poverty. So I think these two things alone could have a dramatic impact. I also think that RTI and differentiated instruction is absolutely critical. Some of the most effective high schools that I have seen, these are high schools that didn't have K-8 feeder schools. They basically took the K-8 kids and then they put them in a high school environment. They designed their courses to accommodate what I would refer to as differentiated learning. You didn't take the algebra course. You took a whole sequence of benchmarks. So, you weren't necessarily a sophomore or junior. You were just progressing through the benchmarks in a differentiated way that allowed students to, I don't want to say move at their own pace, but to move at different paces appropriate to their level of knowledge. It's interesting in the military. We already talked about the military, how the military trains people and how they can take these young kids and they train them almost immediately. There's no end of course exam in the military. There's no one exam that you've taken after you get out of basic training other than a 10-mile march. Or when you graduate from the infantry officer basic course, they don't take you in and give you a graduate exit exam. No. There are 26 tasks that you have to master, and you move from one task to another to another. And if you stumble on one task, you go back and you take that task again. You don't take everything else again. So it's like differentiated learning. You move from task to task. Now, maybe they don't allow you to necessarily the type of freedom to move at your own pace, but they do allow you to go back and to recover and to cover the thing that you never learned, not to go over the stuff that you've already learned. So I think we could talk about a lot of, I could talk about the importance of character education, of confidence building, the importance of having schools open year-round and during the day so children can be in an environment where they feel safe and secure, where they feel nurtured, where their health care is taken care of. We could talk a lot about those things, but the one thing that continues to strike me is the differentiation between high-income families and low-income families in terms of their access to special education, to early childhood services, and their effective and their their access to summer programs. I also want to make one other point too, and this is where RTI comes in. I think RTI is a very effective alternative to continually misclassifying students as special ed, particularly minority students. Sue Gamm, I think, gave me 3 statistics: 9%, 22%, 80%. 9% were the number of African American boys in the public school student population. 22% are the number who are classified as special ed. 80% are the number who are classified as special ed who have no cognitive disabilities. Is there a more punitive tracking system than to put someone and classify someone who we just didn't teach how to read or write and to classify them or to misclassify them as special ed? This is where RTI comes in. Where you're not necessarily misclassifying them, but you're putting those students in Tier 3, where you can provide the appropriate interventions. So you're not permanently labeling them or permanently classifying them. Yet because you're doing 90 minutes of intervention a day, you're providing them with more support than they ever achieved in the traditional special education classroom. So RTI, which was developed by special education teachers, Sue Gamm, of course, being one of the premier special education teachers and administrators, it is also a game changer. And that is the type of game changer that can have an impact on the children, on the low income, the poor. minority low-income children that you referred to. Next question. Sorry.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. Can you talk a bit about your work in Haiti and Chile and the particular challenges you face with those districts?
Right.
And how do you measure success in either of those places, if it's any different than how you measure success here? Thank you.
In 2 minutes? All right, very quickly. I was in my 4th year in New Orleans. I actually split my time. I was invited by the Inter-American Developmental Bank to go to Haiti and develop and to work with the President's Commission on school reform to develop a plan to build a functioning school system in Haiti. 90% of children in Haiti go to private schools. Most of the private schools, 2 rooms, 3 rooms, teacher earning $900 a year. Public school teachers only earn $2,200 a year. 9th grade, reading level, no technology, blackboard, 50 kids in the classroom. In impeccably groomed uniforms with perfect cursive, because these kids are so desperate for a quality education. So you know, I have a longer answer to that question. The Wilson Center is actually publishing a paper next month that I co-authored on our Haiti experience and on the and on the evolution of school reform efforts in Haiti that really speak to that issue. There is no functioning school system in Haiti, and what I and others have attempted to do is to design a program to begin to build the institutional framework for a functioning school system. When 70% of your teachers are not certified and 70% of your schools are not certified, and maybe 80% are not regulated, and we're outside Port-au-Prince, only 20% of the country doesn't even have a single public school. Believe me, there was no functioning system prior to the earthquake. So what we've been attempting to do is to design one, and so I could spend a long time talking about how much progress they've made or what the impediments to progress are, but I'll save that for a later day. Let me make one comment about Chile. Chile is not is in no way a third world country. They are a developed country. They probably, academically, I think they rank 2nd in South and Central America in terms of academic performance. There's a lot of debate over Chile because there's been a lot of student protests, mostly involving the higher education system, because there's been a dramatic increase in the number of students who have entered the higher education system. But unlike the K-12 system, the higher education system is not heavily subsidized. Instead, students who might 10, 15 years ago not have had an opportunity to enroll in university, et cetera, who are now enrolling from lower income groups, middle to lower income groups, took out loans and got loans, and those loans came due, a lot like what we've experienced here. And when the cost of the loan is 4 times the amount that you paid in tuition in a single year, and the jobs are not readily available for you to begin to pay off those loans, it's going to make some people angry. I worked in the primary grades in 1,100 schools, and basically what we did was 3 things. We worked with the Ministry of Education to develop core curriculum models that we can make available to schools that were really struggling. So we took the curriculum materials that they had and we aligned it. And incidentally, my curriculum team, Seal Cannon, and all traditional educators from Philadelphia, retired, wrote the curriculum in partnership with a number of really prominent principals from the Chicago Public Schools. Carlos Escortia was very helpful, Armando Armendariz, and Armando and a group of really gifted, extraordinary Spanish-speaking principals came and joined our team. We had about 6 or 7 people. So we developed these curriculum instructional models. The second thing we did was we created an RTI system. They really don't have an RTI system. They have tracking, permanent tracking. They have some special ed, and they have some differentiated instruction. But by and large, you get tracked early and you stay in the track. Well, convenient for us, there's 3 tracks. So we designed interventions for each of the tracks so we could create an RTI system out of their tracking system, you see. And then the third thing we did was we designed an instructional leadership team model so that we could assemble teams in the schools that could then train their teachers, teach their teachers how to use the curriculum, how to do intervention, how to do differentiated instruction. And we organized 120 what we call instructional support teams, all Chileans, each of whom took 10 schools and worked with those schools. Now, the schools had to sign up for the program, and 90% of schools were private, or public, We didn't lay off a single principal, didn't dismiss a single teacher. That was not our purview. They had great success. Their test scores went up, and and for the first time in years, they had an improvement in math scores, because I insisted that we do math simultaneously as doing the primary grades. I also wanted to do some things in the universities, but they said no. So maybe if I make the offer, they might have reconsidered in light of what's happened. But it was a very good experience there, and it was great. It's a really dynamic country, and it's a beautiful country. So I'm still involved in Haiti and continue to go back and forth from Haiti. You know, somebody has to. You know, the problem is countries like that get their 15 minutes of attention, and then it's all forgotten until the next disaster. So, you know, sometimes it took so long to wreck that country, and there's a tendency to blame Haiti every single time something is not successful, when really the international community, particularly the NGO community, which dominates the country and whom 95% of the relief money goes through, should share the responsibility when reforms are not successful. So we'll continue to work there. Yes, sorry about that.
Oh, no, coming back to
All right.
America.
Sorry.
You know, this series is about a crisis in public education,
Right.
but my opinion is that what we're really talking about is a crisis in urban public education. There is no crisis here in Elmhurst with public education. People are flocking to come here. And I know that one of the knocks on bureaucracy is they just throw money at problems.
Right.
But I'm hoping maybe you can take a minute and educate us a little bit about per pupil spending. Places like Lake Forest and Elmhurst, they throw money at a problem. And they have great schools and great teachers and great outcomes. You spoke a little bit about the advantages kids have outside of school and before school when they come from affluent areas, but this advantage that they have in school because of per pupil spending. I'm wondering if you could educate us a little bit about per pupil spending in Chicago or New Orleans versus per pupil spending in a place like this or Lake Forest.
Okay. Look, you know, I think per pupil spending does make a difference. I mean, but you look at an urban district like New York, what's the per pupil spending there, like $19,000, $20,000, $21,000? When I lived Chicago, it was like $8,000. When I lived Philadelphia, it was like $8,800. New Orleans, it was $10,400. Incidentally, the Recovery School District actually got less than the state average because there's myths. Everybody's trying to rationalize why the growth occurred there. The first schools to charter in New Orleans were traditional public schools because the old school board, of which something like 3 dozen people were indicted, including the board president went to jail prior to the hurricane. When the hurricane occurred, they were incapable of getting the schools open. So the public schools went to the state and said, we'll open ourselves. And that's what they did. They just opened themselves. They took control of their own destiny, the teachers, the principals, and things like that. So Bridgeport is about, I think it's 13.4. Connecticut, obviously, regionally, you know, you're going to have differences. We're the poorest funded, and we're 13.4. When did we ever have $13,400 to spend? I won't say that because New Haven has even more in Hartford. But the point is, that's not an insignificant amount. But when 22% goes to healthcare alone, and I'm not criticizing, that's a diversion. You know, so I think, you know, that there is a fact, you know, that does play a factor. But let me just tell you, you know, when you look at the performance of low-income poverty children in Chicago, and a study was done about 6 or 7 years ago. I don't know whether or not it was the Commercial Club who did it, and they compared the performance, the effectiveness of instruction among low-income minority children in Chicago, and they compared it with the suburbs. They discovered that Chicago, despite less funding per pupil, actually did perform, you know, those children did better in Chicago than they did in some of the most affluent suburbs. So you know, the question is, does per pupil funding differences is a factor, but also efficient use of resources is a factor. The right programs is a factor. You know, the interesting thing in New Orleans is because the schools get their budgets and the money really follows the kids. The central office consumes 2% of the resources that go to the individual schools. And the schools have so much autonomy on how they design their school and how they design their day, and obviously, depending on the school, reasonable flexibility on staffing issues. They're able to get a much bigger bang for their buck, and so at $10,400, you got a teacher and an aide in the classroom. You know, I forgot to mention that in some of the best performing schools, large numbers of classrooms, and sometimes most of the classrooms has a second person helping that teacher in that classroom. You know, not only with special ed kids, but with RTI, you see. So it's, you know, I think clearly, the better question to pose to me would be, if I had Elmhurst money, how would I spend it? And I would spend it in an extended day, and I would expend it, and I would spend it in extended year, because that additional instructional time on task does make a difference when you have quality instruction. And I would spend it on providing additional staff support in the schools, physical support, whether it's graduate student interns or what we used to do in Philadelphia is we would actually subsidize our student teachers so we could get about 1,000 to come to the district, train them like first-year teachers, and then embed them in the classroom where they could work side by side with the teacher. It was extraordinary because they provided that teacher, because of the standardized curriculum, they provided that teacher with real help. They got a great experience, and they provided that teacher with almost immediate help. That's how I would spend that additional money. I think that's universal early childhood. Those are kind of the 4 or 5 things that I think are critical if you're going to close the achievement gap and if you're going to really help inner city kids perform better. I don't know if I answered that question really well.
You know, but why not the battle about getting more money?
No.
Is it fair to have $16,500 per kid here and $8,800 per kid there?
You know what? No one, and for some of you all who have worked with me, how did I get more money in Chicago? You know what? Because Pate Phillip wasn't really supportive of the Chicago Public Schools, the only way we were going to get more money from old Pate was to improve our enrollment and attendance. So over a 6-year period, my enrollment went up 34,000 to 434. Now the city's declined. God knows why. I'm not going to pass judgment. I don't say anything about my successors or predecessors. This is my rule of thumb. Just that alone pumped $70, $80 million more. I could go, I got more money. You can't do anything about it. Average daily attendance that was designed to like hurt us suddenly helped us, because every year our truancy rate was going down and our attendance was going up, and we were getting more money on top of the money that Edgar, to his credit, tried to get to the school. So, you know, I'm gearing up to do a chef-type, contemplating a chef-type lawsuit like Hartford did in Connecticut, so the poorest funded district in the state can get the additional funding that Hartford got. All right, so you know, I'm always gonna, you know, I screamed and shouted when I got the East German judge and didn't get raced to the top when I was in Louisiana. You know what I mean? You know, so getting additional funds is important, but I have always been put in situations where my funds were limited. So I could either, and I'm not saying funding is an excuse, a legitimate excuse, but I am always put in a position where I've got to take a district that's broke. You know, Bridgeport had a huge deficit. I worked with Stephen Pryor, the state commissioner, volunteered in Haiti. I met him. He asked me to help fix Bridgeport, the largest city, poorest city in Connecticut. You know, we had a huge budget hole. It's closed. Plus, we have our curriculum reforms, our RTI, our laptop computers, we're doing all these things. So I've always been in the position where I've been put into a situation where I've never gone into a situation where I had a balanced budget. It was always a district in deficit with large debts with a dysfunctional education plan. So I'm like genetically incapable of using funding as an excuse. That doesn't mean I try to get more funding. My experience, though, has been that when you have success, people want to reward success. And so I've always been able to secure additional funding in ways, either direct or indirect ways. And generally, we've always been able to secure funding from sources that we might not traditionally have expected funding to come from. I mean, you know, the Republicans in Philadelphia gave Philadelphia a lot of money during my tenure, additional money. The Speaker of the House actually championed the reforms there, and he gave us considerable money. Also allowed me to cap the money that the state had appropriated to these private school providers who had been selected prior to my arrival. But yet 6 years later, the current Republican governor cut the education budget in the state of Pennsylvania by $1 billion. How do you survive $238 million in budget cuts if you're an urban city? That and no continuation of stimulus money. So anyway, so that's the reason. It's not that I don't think additional funding is important. It's just that for me, I'm always trying to figure out how to work with what I have, and most teachers do that on a day-to-day basis. God bless them. Most teachers say, well, you know, these are the cards I've been dealt, and I'm going to do my very best. Other questions?
Paul, thank you for
Yes.
sharing your experience with the audience. My question focuses on two items. We have two little girls, and we have put them in Kuman, an enrichment program, since they were age 3. And so they both right now are about 2 levels or 2 grades ahead. My first question is, do you feel that if by them being that far ahead, are we creating a disadvantage for them when they are in school because they are continuously taken out of school because we want this enrichment? So they are getting this extra hours of instruction a week. And do you feel that there is an advantage to public school versus private school? And then also, how far do you think the United States children or students will be competitive compared to our other higher education or higher performing countries?
Mm-hmm. Let me just say that, I always tell parents, get the best education that you can afford to provide them with. And if you can't afford to provide them with a quality education, or with the best education that you feel, if you don't have the means to do it, then go find the best school to put your kids in. Because, when people criticize people for sending their kids to parochial schools or private schools, or when people try to play the income game, oh my God, affluent parents get, we are obligated to raise our children right. And if we don't, believe me, they will continue to be a burden on us well into our retirement years. So you've got to do the very best. That said and done, I think a public school education and exposing children to the diversity that exists and is more likely to exist in a public school classroom as opposed to a traditional private is a very healthy thing. So sometimes I think the best balance is a good, really high-quality public school education along with those extracurricular activities that you have your children involved in. But I think what's really important is to give children, it's the best schools take advantage of the really bright kids within their classrooms. One of the best approaches to RTI is to allow the students that are not in need of intervention, particularly some of the older students, to work with the students who are in Tier 2 and Tier 3, whether it's reading to them, whether it's coaching them, and some of the best RTI programs, because, I always say that there's a 4th tier, and that's the accelerated tier, the gifted tier. When you have those kids working with the kids that are struggling, it's a healthier situation to be in. I think, then the kids are more comfortable with the really smart kid in the class because the smart kid in the class is helping them out. And then, of course, the really, I don't want to say smart kid, but the advanced child in the class feels a lot more comfortable because they're almost doing kind of playing a Good Samaritan type role. So I think a lot of it really depends on the teacher. But, if you have the means, continue to put your children in those enrichment programs and to expose them to those enrichment opportunities. Oh, I don't think our K-8 system, I think the competitiveness of our K-8 system has been diminished. And I think in large part it's not because our instruction is inferior, and it certainly is not because our teachers are weaker. It's simply because there is more instructional time on task. That, you look at Singapore math is not better than University of Chicago math. I used University of Chicago math 3 times. I had great results. I'm using Singapore math now because my chief academic officer recommended it, and so did the teachers. So I'm living with Singapore math, and it's a great math curriculum. The difference between what Singapore math and University of Chicago math, when it's taught in Singapore and when it's taught in Chicago, is you get like 60 more days of Singapore math. You get, 34% more instructional time. Actually, I think it's even more Singapore math. Somebody did a calculation in Massachusetts that said the amount of time spent on math curriculum K-8 a year is 147 hours. 147 hours. And they had increased it. They were bragging that they had increased it. 147 hours of math instruction. What was the school calendar again? What is it, 180 days? I don't know what it is in Massachusetts. That means they're spending 45 minutes, or somebody's going to say I don't know my math, but I mean, that is less than an hour, isn't it? I'm saying facetiously. I mean, what's wrong with this picture? And Massachusetts has some of the most advanced test scores in the state. That's what puts us at a disadvantage. Children need more instructional time, particularly poor children, particularly children who have struggled, who didn't have the early childhood interventions, who spent a lot of idle time over the summer. One of the things that we attempted to do in New Orleans was to design a school year that limited the amount of time off for students to no more than 5 weeks, and for teachers 4 weeks. But there were all sorts of blocks during the school year. So, for example, you had 2 weeks in Christmas off, you had spring vacation off, you had Easter off. Yes, they can have Easter off there because they call their school districts parishes. So when you're in a state with parishes, you can clearly take some liberties, church and state. Yes, Jazz Fest week off, Mardi Gras off. Nobody shows up for Mardi Gras. So there's a lot of time, there's a lot of pit stops along the way. And I'm not saying every school adhered to these schedules, but by and large, the school day was about a year was about 200 days, and the school day was generally about 8 hours. In some schools, even longer. And that made a difference. That's why the test scores are growing at 2 to 3 times the rate of growth that you're seeing at the state level. So, so I think those type of things make a difference. And that's where we have to level the playing field, because we've always had advantages in our higher ed system because it's been so demographic. I mean, we deny our kids elementary school and in middle grade choices, but we don't deny them higher ed choices. You can go here, you can go to Moraine Valley Community College. You got the community college system, you got universities, you pick your colleges, you pick your universities. You know what I mean? I didn't mean to compare Elmhurst College with Moraine Valley. I apologize for that, all right? Moraine's a great community college, though. I went to Moraine Valley. But what I'm saying is you have your choices. You have your choices of, you certainly have far fewer choices at the elementary, secondary level. So I think the best way to close the gap is to lengthen the school day and lengthen the school year. I just think you have to, I think that's mandatory. That absolutely has to happen. Oh, yes. Yes. Sorry.
This will be the last question.
Oh, I'm going to stick around if you have more questions, okay?
Sir, I was lucky enough to be in the room in 1999 when you brought in the principals from the schools that had the ROTC programs.
Oh, yeah.
And told them to get those programs out of the basements. They were down next to the furnaces, and they were just hidden, basically. And you said that being an officer in the military was not something to be ashamed of, and it's a career field like any other. And you brought them out of the basements. You created 2 high schools that were full academies. Today there are 7 full
Yes.
academies in the city.
Yes.
So I just wanted to say that I was wondering if you had carried this
Yes.
military model with you
Yeah.
and had done the same type of things throughout the other locations.
Well, let me just say this. I actually left the city with 5 military academies. The 2 freestanding Brownsville Military Academy, which is a historic African-American landmark. And when we had the dedication, and we had the Tuskegee Airmen and some legendary, because it's amazing how many legendary African-American decorated soldiers had gone through the Brownsville Armory. It was built, by the Brownsville community because the African-American troops in the 1920s trained in a barn, and the non-African-American troops were in these monolithic armories. So it was great. I opened 2 in Philadelphia, and in New Orleans, we opened an inter-district military academy right off it's called Federal City. It's the Marine Corps Military Complex. And I just opened one, and it's going to be housed on Bridgeport University campus. It's a naval academy. So yeah, they're extraordinarily successful. I always say, you want to keep your child out of the military? Send them to the military academy. So it's great. My son, incidentally, got into the service not because of the military academy. We're not gung-ho. I think maybe his mother being a cop had something to do with it, police officer. But he just returned from Afghanistan, and safe and sound. And now he's going to EMT school and things like that. I just have to throw that out. So yeah, he did. He saved a lot of lives there. So I'm pretty proud of him. Anyway, I'll take one more question and I'll hang around for anyone who wants. I'll take yours. You were straining back there.
You're talking about the longer school day. My kid clearly accepts a longer school day, less break in the summertime, for no homework.
Well, you know, what I'm trying to do is, you know, I always, what's the term in sports parlance? You take what the defense gives you. You know, in New Orleans, I was able to really work with the community to build a district from scratch. And let me tell you, all the ingredients were there. I always say that I came down to New Orleans, and my goal was to remove the obstacles. They had plenty of good ideas. They just needed someone who didn't feel the need to control everything and was agnostic as to who operated a school as long as it was a not-for-profit and as long as it was a quality school model. I always say I was like the French joined the Revolutionary War. I said, I'm like the French. I joined the war late and got partial credit for the victory. But your question, sorry.
No, the kids would like to have longer
Yeah,
days. They
yeah.
accept that, but they want
Yeah.
to wait.
Well, let me tell you what we're trying to do. You know, Connecticut is a very blue state, so I'm trying to extend the day by keeping the schools open so the kids can, because as you migrate, you know, as you bring more technology into the schools, you can extend the day without necessarily the personnel costs. So the idea is to have a series of learning labs that the kids can, particularly at the high school level, kids can take courses, they can do enrichment, they can do accelerated. We're taking all of our core courses and creating reteach courses. So you struggle in algebra, you go to a reteach lab. You cover things, all the children have a Chromebook, so they can go over any course that they went over during the day. So the idea here is to lengthen the school day for the kids and to, you know, kind of shuttle your staff, have different starting times, so you in effect create the extended school day without necessarily the cost. And part of that extended school day is, we like to say, it's an hour of tutoring intervention and it's homework hour. So the kids can stay at school, complete their homework, and then they can go home. But by the time they go home, it'll be supper time. You know, so that's what we're trying to do. So I agree, I'll work that deal out anytime. All right, kids can do their homework at school, stay until supper time. And so we're trying to do some things like that, homework clubs, you know, that the kids can participate in, because we simply can't extend the day without paying for it or without negotiating in the next collective bargaining agreement, which we're going to try to do. Yes, ma'am. Oh, well, you know, the universities want to partner with us on teacher training programs. Yeah, and you'll find that universities will generally tailor their programs to suit your needs, particularly, I don't want to say the more modest universities in terms of quality, the more modest, the little independent universities. Like, I always had my greatest success with Loyola and DePaul. Barbara Sizemore at DePaul, God bless her. So she was just fantastic. Or at Sacred Heart and Fairfield University, which are two really prominent Catholic universities, and University of Bridgeport too, which is these are small universities, and they accommodate us in many ways. One of the things we're doing with the universities, though, on the professional development side, though, not on the professional development side, is we've established. I'm a believer that schools, that the future high schools really have to be like air traffic control towers that direct kids to different settings. So more and more of what our students are doing in the high schools are now off campus. So University of Bridgeport is setting up a series of engineering programs for kids. So, you know, Bridgeport is not a big city, so the kids can take engineering even though it's not offered at their school, or they can go to a site and take these vocational tech sites, these tertiary sites, where, so if there's no voc tech in their school, in the afternoon they can go take auto shop, or they can do electronics and things like that. So all of the universities embrace dual enrollment. We give there is an exam called the AccuPlacer, which is an exam that most of the community colleges and some of the universities give to determine whether or not children are in need of remedial instruction when they're admitted, doubting, you know, whether or not the kids are ready. And so we give all the juniors the AccuPlacer, and if they their junior year. And if they pass it, all the universities will automatically enroll them in courses their senior year for dual credit. So they can be exposed to university campus. That includes affluent Fairfield, the Jesuit University, or Sacred Heart, or Bridgeport University, and the community college. The students who fail the AccuPlacer, then their senior year, they take the remedial courses that they will have to take if they graduated and failed the AccuPlacer test. So when they graduate, they're ready. No remedial courses. You see, it's a no-brainer. And it doesn't cost me anything more than I'm already paying, because instead of the kids taking, the courses are cannibalized so that they can be enrolled in Housatonic Community College AccuPlacer or remedial courses. Or, instead of taking an elective, instead of taking woodshop their senior year because they have to do the filler electives, they can be taking English 1 or Algebra 1 at Sacred Heart University for dual credit. And they get all the supports, all the counseling, all the interventions that they provide for their regular freshman students. They can access the gym, the cafeteria, the auditorium, all those type of things. So these things are no-brainers. Oh, can I ask a second question? No, I'm joking. People need to leave, and I think they're too polite just to get up and walk. So I'm gonna take a Spanish pause, as they like to say, and then I'll
Well, let's thank
okay?
Paul Vallas again.
And I'll hang around. Thank you. Thank you very much.